Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of Project Slave 1. The last episode was a real turning point for this build, as I can now see the full silhouette of this monster project. It's something I'm really proud of, and from all the feedback I've been getting, I think you guys like it too. I really appreciate the comments, it motivates me tremendously. Not to finish this build as quickly as possible, but to continue to build Slave 1 to the best of my ability. Don't forget to make sure you're subscribed to my channel, so you don't miss the rest of this series, and if you think a friend would enjoy this project, share it with them too. My next project will also be Star Wars related, but you'll have to wait for Slave 1 to be finished before I reveal what that is. Right, let's get on with this episode. I'm going to tackle the underside of the hull, immediately in front of the wings. The parts for this section, and all of the underside, are going to be designed from scratch. Fortunately, I have some great reference material from Sculpting a Galaxy by Lorne Peterson and Star Wars Chronicles by Deborah Fine. After scanning these two images and a little cutting and pasting, I've got a pretty good image of the underside of Slave 1. My objective has always been to create a credible Slave 1, not a replica of the original model, but a well-engineered spaceship. So where the parts don't fit or align on the original, they'll be made to fit on mine. Where detail is missing, I'll add it, all the time trying to keep true to the character of the original Slave 1. My first step is to load the underside image into my CAD software and scale it to the same size as my Slave 1. From this I've designed a mock-up of the lower gambody hull and main wing mount from which I can build off of. If the parts I designed fit this, they should fit my model. I'm going to start with the detail panel that goes on the face of the wing mount. This is where the seismic charges are deployed from, but the original model doesn't have any provision for this. I want to change that. In Season 2 of The Mandalorian, we get a pretty good view of how that works. It's one of the coolest, most deadly features of Slave 1, and it goes back to what I said earlier about respecting the original, but building on it in the best possible way. Who doesn't love a good seismic charge? And here's what I've designed. The centre section is all new and represents the two sliding doors that open to reveal the charges. The outer sections are based on the studio model and have rails for the doors at the top and bottom. The outer clamps have 7-sided socket bolts. A few hours later and the part is 3D printed. As ever with the new printer, the detail is super crisp. I gave the part plenty of supports as I wanted to minimise any distortion during printing and curing. This method is certainly a lot easier than scratch building from styrene. Trying to get this part totally square would have been a nightmare any other way, even with kit parts. Okay, let's chop off the supports and see what we've got. This can be done prior to curing when the supports are softer and easier to remove, but that can cause distortion and damage the detail, both of which I wanted to avoid. I'm trying to design all the parts for the underside with printing in mind, so that there's no need for supports where there's detail. Detail and supports are always a bad combination in 3D printing. Ideally I want as few parts as possible, but I have to consider how big I can print and breaking down the parts for painting. It still needs a bit of cleaning up, but that won't take long. Okay, now on to the next part, the main engine. This is a very distinctive feature of Slave 1, but it's very easy to create in the 3D software. The basic profile is just tracked around an outline, and there you have it. I've added some detailed spaces on the outside for alignment, and that's the outside done. On the original model, this was lit by a couple of bulbs, and I figured why not recreate those? They look pretty credible, and will sit behind some frosted acrylic anyway. It's just a small nod to the fact that the original model was engineered with a different level of technology, back in the day. Again, these were quick and easy to print, with hardly any cleaning up needed. I just needed to cut away the supports, sand the underside flat, and fit the dummy bulb unit. I'm just using nail cutters to chop the supports off here. Because they're all on the underside, or in areas that'll never be seen, I don't need to worry too much about the witness marks on the prints. I just have to be careful I don't break anything. You'll have seen from my last video that my display stand was sadly lacking. So I've drawn up some parts to get a new one made. This will consist of a 450mm square base plate, on which a 25mm pole will be mounted. At the top of the pole, either a straight or angled mount which can be screwed into Slave 1 will locate. My next problem was how to make it. Fortunately, I had the help of a fellow member of my local model club, the North Devon Model Society. Barry is a former pattern maker and has a well-equipped workshop, and although he specialises in parts for bikes, he offered to help me with my stand. So, if you need something making for your Harley or Brit bike, check out his website. There's a link in the description. He may be able to help you. Right, back to Slave 1. We're now going to tackle the main event, the antenna dish and mount. The photo gave me an excellent plan view of these parts, and I knew that the fairings behind the dish were from a 1/8 scale Entex Porsche, so I had a really good starting point. I found some plans online of the Porsche, and after resizing and scaling them, I set about designing the front wing in my CAD software. I did get a bit carried away here and designed way more than I needed to, but it's all good practice. I'll use the same plans to design the rear wing parts for the circular engine fairings in the next episode. So that I could get maximum detail below the dish, I designed a base plate to fill as much of the space as possible. Above this would be the main mount, with the 2 Porsche wings and various other details. Beneath the dish was entirely down to my own imagination. I had to be careful to avoid clashing with the lower hull, hence the crazy contours, but it went well. I figured such a high-powered dish would need cooling, so my plan was to make provision for refrigerant and radiators. Various edges were tidied up to make the shape flow better, and the part was done. The dish was the easiest part to recreate, as I could work straight off the plan. I just had to play around with the depth to get it to look right, and then detail up the 2 side aerials. Now all the parts had been designed, all I had to do was print them out and put them together. I was a bit nervous about how I was going to print the base unit, but got lucky, and it just fitted on my printer. This meant I could print it in one piece, and not have to worry about printing it in parts. I got so excited that I forgot to make it hollow in the slicer software. This meant that it would use a lot of resin and weigh a ton. Oops. Fortunately, it and all the other parts printed successfully. The main part was a nail-biting 29 hours, but it came out really well. The smaller parts were immaculate, although I expect the underside of the dish will need a fair bit of cleaning up once the supports are removed. Again, it was time to break out the nail clippers and cut off the supports. The base detail had a lot of support, which came off surprisingly well, just leaving me to flatten down the back with some sandpaper. I'd added some tiny internal supports to an overhang in the main dish, but could just poke these out with a sculpting tool. The main supports were cut out in the usual way, but I had to be careful not to put the dish under any strain for fear of an edge breaking away. The resin is strong, but brittle edges are a particular concern when cutting the supports off. That actually went very well. There's a lot to clean up and fill on the back face, but I kind of expected that. It'll be fine. I used much smaller supports for the 2 side aerials, and it paid off. The supports came away very easily, and with only minimal cleaning up needed. When I remove the supports, I always cut as close to the base as possible first. This puts less strain on the actual part, minimising the chance of damage. Now onto the main antenna mount, again starting cutting close to the base. There's a real forest of supports here. I tried to go for overkill with the supports, as repairing damage from the odd support takes a lot less time than reprinting a failed print. It's always an exciting time cutting these off, and I try not to get carried away and damage the print. I will admit, sometimes my enthusiasm does get the better of me though. And there it is, with all the supports removed. Although it's not all good, let's take a closer look. If we take a square and a straight edge, you can see that the back lower edges are massively distorted. This is probably one of the effects of not hollowing the part in the slicer, but I don't think it's a disaster. Too much material like this can be filed away, and filler can correct any minor damage. I think it honestly looks worse than it is. At least no detail is affected, and the cylindrical tanks look virtually unscathed. I'll come back to that later. Let's take a look at another minor but important detail on the lower hull. The two wings are linked by a bar that runs between the engine and main wing mount. I've drawn up some mounts in my CAD software and I'm going to cut them out in brass. The paper patterns are cut out and stuck onto two sheets of brass, which are bolted together. One bolt hole is where the linking bar will go, the other will be affixing to the end of the wing roots. A quick visit to the hacksaw and the bulk of the brass has been cut away. And after a final clean-up with files, the brass is flush with the edge of the design. With the nuts and screws removed, you can see I now have two matching brackets. Now I just have to join them together. The linking bar is a piece of 3mm brass rod, just soldered into place. This process actually went a lot easier than I expected. I'll only mount this to Slave 1 temporarily for now, as it'll be coming apart several times before it gets its final fit and finish, so don't worry if it looks a little wonky at times. Good news! My stand's arrived! I've gone for a brushed finish on the base plate and a polished main shaft. The base plate is 4mm thick aluminium, but it's still very heavy. The whole thing needs to be very strong, as Slave 1 is going to be about 6 kilos when it's finished. Because of this, we decided to go with aluminium for the vertical mount, but stainless steel for the angled mount. These parts are beautifully made and will set Slave 1 off perfectly. Okay, let's get back to the 3D prints. After a lot of filing and sanding, I have success. The base part is now flat and square. It actually looked a lot worse than it was. At least none of the detail was affected, but I'll know next time to be sure I make my parts hollow in the slicer software before I print them. The dish and aerials are also cleaned up, and I've turned up the aerial ends from brass rod in my Dremel. This was really easy to do, you just have to be slow and steady. I made the square end by hammering the rod flat before filing it to shape and tapering the shaft. And here are the main parts for the antenna. The detailed base plate fits under the main mount by locating at the back edge and under the centre of the antenna. It fits flush and really helps add much needed detail to the area behind the dish. You probably won't see much of it, but we know it's there. Then the main dish just sits on top. I'm so pleased, it looks great. Everything lines up and fits. This is going to look fantastic in the hull. I've added some missing detail to the inner rim of the hull with some styrene and 3D printed a small part just under the nose. The detail panel is going to get plenty of superglue as it's going on for good. I just have to make sure I get it on the right way round. That would be rather unfortunate. That looks great! Now let's fit the rest of the parts to the hull. As you've seen before, the base plate and main dish mount fit together as one unit. They locate well in the hull, filling any gaps with detail up to the wings, which is just what I wanted. The dish fits on perfectly, I just have to make sure it's properly aligned. Then it's the main engine with its detailed interior. This just locates with a couple of pins into holes drilled into the wing base plate. To finish everything off, the brass wing linkage just tucks into place. Perfect. Okay, let's check out how she looks on the stand, first with the straight mount. This is really difficult to film as I don't have a lot of space, but I hope you like it. I've added the guns for this shot, so you can now see Slave 1 in all her glory. This is the takeoff and landing configuration, but you can't see the underside. Well, let's switch to the angled mount and see what we've got. That's much better. Now you can see what I've been working on in this episode. Everything lines up perfectly. I had to take the guns off, as like the wings and dish parts, they're still removable for painting. But you should see everything together in the next episode, when I finish detailing the underside. The other engines and associated pipework and parts should be fairly straightforward to design and print. It'll just be a matter of designing one side and mirroring it. Although I expect it won't be quite so easy, it seldom is. There's a few minor areas I want to tweak, but hopefully, by the end of the next episode, it should be ready for paint. I hope you're enjoying Project Slave 1. If you are, please share with your friends, and make sure you subscribe to my channel. So you catch my next video when it goes live, click on the bell icon. As you can see from my channel, I have lots of other projects, like my mouse tank, Bluebird, T80 and Stug, which I hope you find interesting. To learn about some of the techniques I used, check out my how-to series to find out more about moulding, casting, CAD design and 3D printing. If you have any questions about Project Slave 1, just leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.